Thank you, Andrea. I appreciate the introduction. Hello, everyone. As Andrea mentioned, I'm James Park, Chief Business Officer at Samsung Biologics. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our first ever virtual networking forum, Shaping the Future of Pharma. I noticed on the social media that many of today's panelists are wearing blue today. Could that be because of today's BlueBetterFly theme? Or the chance of winning a Samsung Galaxy Fold 2 later today? Or perhaps both? In case you're wondering, today's BlueBetterFly theme encompasses three core concepts. First, blue, representing Samsung, as you can see my logo here. Second, better, recognizing continuous improvement, striving to be better for a better life. And then lastly, fly, illustrating the butterfly effect, where the small things we do every day accumulate and make a broader impact. As the future of pharma is being shaped before our eyes, we as an industry experienced major disruption from the COVID-19 pandemic that has impacted not only our business activities, but our personal life as well. The convenience of the daily living is such difficulty. As for me, I enjoy traveling, especially to meet our clients. An added benefit is that I was able to stop by US to see my family. But unfortunately, due to COVID pandemic, I was not able to travel this year as much. While the patients we serve suffer from this virus, our industry is uniquely positioned to provide treatments and cures for humanity's sake. The pharmaceutical industry has come together in both areas of research and development and manufacturing to collaborate with a common goal. Such collaborations include Vir Biotechnology and GSK, AstraZeneca and Oxford University, along with Eli Lilly and Amgen. Samsung Biologics has also had the opportunity to join the fight against COVID-19 through both existing client relationships and forging a new partnerships. With this week's news of Pfizer and its biotech partner, BioNTech, releasing a phase 3 data on its experimental pandemic vaccine candidate, showing more than 90% of effectiveness, it shows how collaboration can promote innovation and provide hope to a promising future in pharma. As an end-to-end CDMO service provider, Samsung Biologics has witnessed eye-opening development of biologics during the past decade. And these innovative drugs have led to improving and saving countless lives. With increasing advances in science and technology and innovation, the complex therapeutics are set to become even more important in improving healthcare worldwide. Samsung Biologics has positioned ourselves to be a major contributor to the support pharmaceutical companies in the development and manufacturing of such treatments, including COVID-19. According to Bio, such innovations are transforming patient outcomes. 83% of children with cancer now survive, compared to just 58% in 1970. There's also been a 22% reduction in cancer death since 1991. And more than 730,000 children's lives have been saved in the last 20 years in the US because of advances in vaccines. We are honored to be part of this journey to shape the future of pharma, supporting our global partners in drug development and manufacturing. To keep pace with the ever-growing trends in biodevelopment and manufacturing, Samsung Biologics is committed to delivering high-quality products to help produce life-saving medicines and make them more accessible to everyone. Our recently announced plan for expansion is in response to the growing demands of biologics, which we believe will benefit not only our clients, but ultimately patients in need all over the world. The scale of capacity offered in Plan 4 will be unmatched, resulting in a standalone, end-to-end facility offering services from cell line development to small, mid, and large-scale manufacturing to meet all clinical and commercial needs. I believe we are gathered here with a consensus on the need to address the prolonged global pandemic and the healthcare challenges we are all being faced with. Today's COVID-19 Emergence Roundtable will provide a forum for industry leaders to openly discuss not only these challenges, but also opportunities that have been created for us to make a direct impact in the fight against COVID-19. Many would argue that the COVID-19 pandemic is the greatest healthcare challenge we have faced since the AIDS pandemic or the pre-penicillin era. Globally, there have been 52.4 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, including, sadly, 1.2 million deaths reported to the World Health Organization. The pandemic is also having an enormous impact on our business sectors across all industries, while also receiving public sector support by programs such as Operation Warp Speed, and working closely with pharma companies to ensure expedited approvals and access to treatments and vaccines. Pharma companies have partnered in the fight against COVID-19, breaking down the barriers by collaborating, to sharing know-how without a profit-first mindset. And some say there will be a new definition of BC, beyond Corona, and AC, after Corona. Even when the short-term effects end, the long-term economic impact will ripple for years to come, putting us into a new normal environment where all collaboration and innovation will have the opportunity to come together within our industry, such as today's virtual roundtable, where pharmaceutical leaders have gathered to have such a conversation. Is anyone familiar with the notion of VUCA? VUCA is an acronym which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The term was first used at the end of the Cold War, when there was no longer a singular enemy, resulting in new ways of seeing and reacting. The concept is, again, gaining popularity within leadership strategies as a term to cover the various dimensions of our uncontrollable environment and uncertain situations. Today, we are fighting a new war against the enemy of COVID-19. The VUCA war has been here before COVID-19, but the pandemic has made change faster and harder to predict. The defining VUCA in a COVID-19 mindset will look something like this. Volatility, changes to COVID-19 are taking place every day. They have been unpredictable, dramatic, and fast. Uncertainty, no one can predict with confidence when the pandemic will end or when we will have a cure or vaccine. Complexity, the pandemic is affecting all aspects of life, including healthcare, business, the economy, and social life in complex ways. Ambiguity, there is no best practice that organizations can follow to manage the challenges caused by the pandemic. Luckily enough, with the many pharma and biotechs joining forces with resilience and perseverance and innovation, we are hearing positive news about promising drug candidates, providing a hope for a vaccination in the near future. Such collaboration is enabling the development and the supply of treatments with unprecedented speed, where we as an industry and as humans have come together to further such mankind. Bill George, a senior fellow at Harvard Business School, defines a type of leadership. He calls it VUCA 2.0, giving a complete new meaning to acronym. V for vision. As today's business leaders, you need the ability to see through the chaos to have a clear vision for your organization. U for understanding, an in-depth understanding of your organization's capabilities and strategies to take advantage of rapidly changing circumstances by playing to its strength while minimizing its weaknesses. C for courage. Leaders need the courage to step up to challenges and make audacious decisions to embody risks and often go against the grain. A for adaptability, embracing the need to be flexible in adapting to this rapidly changing environment is required more now than ever before. As humanity makes choices and we continue to progress, the VUCA world may spell out something to make individuals, families, organizations, and humanity survive. However, the question we now ask is, how do we thrive instead of just survive? We hope the networking forum will offer you a chance to raise and discuss such questions, as well as share key considerations on business continuity, resilience, and adaptability during and after the pandemic. This forum is really designed not only to share with you the experience and the insights of our knowledgeable, highly selected panelists, but also to provide a platform for you to share with us your invaluable expertise, opinions, suggestions, and expectations about the future of pharma. Samsung Biologics is a young company that has made significant strides toward the goal of making a positive impact and enriching human lives by creating a biological ecosystem for our global partners, some of which I mentioned earlier. We don't aim to make such breakthroughs alone. Instead, we ask you, the industry leaders, to join us on the path to achieving this common value and goal, the unmatched objective of the better life for mankind. On this notion, Samsung Biologics would like to express our sincere gratitude to all of the participating professionals gathered here today who are dedicated and willing to realize a common vision to enrich human lives in the industry that we serve. Thank you.
Hello again, and thanks for joining us for today's virtual roundtable, COVID-19 Emergence, brought to you by Informa Pharma Intelligence and sponsored by Samsung Biologics. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Daniel Chancellor, Thought Leadership Director for Informa Pharma Intelligence. Daniel has over a decade of experience as an analyst in the biopharma industry, spanning roles in drug discovery, market analysis, competitive intelligence, and strategic consulting. He now develops and leads Informa Pharma Intelligence Thought Leadership Program, producing materials that help clients across a range of hot topics in the biopharma industry, most recently including COVID-19, immuno-oncology, tumor-agnostic drug development, artificial intelligence, and M&A. As part of this, Daniel regularly participates in webinars, conferences, and other speaking arrangements, and he is featured across leading publications such as Nature Reviews, Drug Discovery, Scientific American, Script, In Vivo, and Vice. And with that, I'll hand things over. Dan, the floor is yours.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks a lot for that introduction, Andrea. I've been looking forward to this discussion for weeks, really, ever since I first saw the panelists that have agreed to take part. I'm really excited by the depth and the range of experiences that this panel can bring to bear on the topic for today. And the topic is, of course, the emergence of COVID and how this interplays with shaping the future of the biopharmaceutical industry. You'll undoubtedly know some of the names already, so I'll skip over full biographies, but you can find these on the main event for this, on the main page for this event. So joining me today, we have two representatives from Big Pharma, and we have Samene Pangalos, who is the Executive Vice President of R&D Biopharmaceuticals at AstraZeneca, and Dr. Michael Devoy, Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Bayer. Also from the world of innovative R&D, we'll be speaking with Dr. Rainer Lichtenberger, CEO and co-founder of the infectious disease specialist Atreva Therapeutics. Our two panelists from the essential world of generic medicines are Dr. James Burt, Executive Vice President for the Europe, Middle East and North Africa region at Accord Therapeutics. And lastly, the Director General of Medicines for Europe, the trade body representing the European generics and biosimilars industry, Adrian van den Hoven. And welcome to everyone on the panel. We're delighted to have you here with us today. So moving on to our topic, I'd like to consider three main themes for this discussion. And these themes are, how has the pandemic affected our businesses? What lessons have we learned? And then how the pandemic will shape the future of our industry. So beginning first with the effect this year on our businesses, I'd like to start by turning to Samene at AstraZeneca. Now, we've all been watching with great interest the therapeutics, and in particular the vaccines coming down the pipeline, and at your company in particular. Can you talk us through a bit of your role in the R&D response, and then any other effects on the AstraZeneca business?
Yeah, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. So it's been probably one of the most, I would say, challenging, but also energizing and really quite incredible years I think we've ever had. And for us, the pandemic started actually late last year because of the big business that we have in China. We were starting to become acutely aware of the impact it was having on our Chinese business. And we started to think very quickly around what we could do to help our colleagues in China. And then, shortly after that, it became clear that the virus and the pandemic was going to spread beyond China and become a global pandemic. And so as an organization, we very much wanted to see what we could do to help and to sort of put our strengths to use in terms of trying to fight the virus and fight the pandemic. So it started initially with, sort of helping source PPE, and we've done a lot of work around that. Then moving on to repositioning our molecules to see what molecules we had in the pipeline that could potentially be tested in COVID-19 disease, drugs like SGLT2 inhibitor dapagliflozin for organ failure, the calibrutinib, try and deal with the cytokine storm. And then we started to move into, okay, so what other strengths do we have within the organization to enable us to move even further? And we used our monoclonal antibody technology to screen thousands of monoclonal antibodies, try and move the monoclonal antibody program rapidly into the clinic, and it's now in phase 3 studies around the world. And partnered with Oxford University, who we knew well, and the Jenner Institute, to try and help them with their ChAdOx1 adenoviral-based vaccine, to help them scale it in terms of the development, but also the supply, to see if we could help actually make that a vaccine where, if it's proven to be safe and effective, could become a globally accessible vaccine, as we've said publicly, a not-for-profit during the pandemic, but one that actually we could help them basically make enough of that it could become a useful therapeutic, because we can do it obviously at industrial scale versus university scale. And I would say we've made great progress. We can talk about the impact it's had on our business overall and how we've adapted. But I would say that our COVID efforts have been focused on those three fronts. And then we've also done a lot of work around testing as well, including setting up a testing centre in the UK to help the government in Cambridge.
So at the start of the year, I suppose vaccines and testing has not businesses you'd necessarily associate with AstraZeneca is, what was leading.
They were not in my objectives.
Yeah.
They were not in my annual objectives. No. No, I mean, this is about, but I think this is one of the wonders of our industry, and it actually shows, people talk about us being slow and unable to move quickly. I think it highlights how quickly we can move as an industry. I'm not just talking about AstraZeneca, I'm talking about our industry. When you look at the number of programs, the progress in research and development across the world, across both large and small companies, diagnostics companies, I mean, I think it's incredible to me when we put our minds to it, how rapidly we have moved, and hopefully, as we start to see now results coming out from Pfizer and others, hopefully as well, including ourselves, I think we can also start to hope to see some light at the end of the tunnel. There still is a long tunnel, there's still a long way to get to the light, but we are starting to see some light, I think, at the end of the tunnel now.
Yeah, absolutely. Some really wonderful news stories, certainly in the last week or so. And I'd like to bring in Dr. Reiner, our other panelist who is, intimately involved with COVID-19 R&D. Can you just walk us through, how the pandemic has affected your business and what your goals have been?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. Actually, I founded Triva Therapeutics as my last, let's say, professional baby 5 years ago, because I was fascinated by the technology. It was a spin out of the University of Tübingen. This is the home of CureVac, Inmatics, and other high-rank infectious disease plays. And I was very unfavorably surprised how difficult it had been to finance such an anti-infective play, a pure play anti-infective, especially for antivirals, because I learned from, I was quite experienced in financing companies, but I learned from my peers there, oh, this is a business model, anti-infective, this is not predictable, this is not a business, we are not interested. Why I'm telling that? Because this drastically changed by the beginning of the year when unfortunately COVID-19 appeared, this black swan, and actually I have to say it helped me and my team really to raise the funds we need now to run our clinical programs. So it was a savior for us, as bitter as it sounds for the rest of the world, because suddenly this awareness for having broad spectrum antivirals, be prepared for pandemics being the current one, being the future ones, this is suddenly found a fruitful soil for our efforts, our R&D efforts. And so we were able to raise this 30 million round together with the European Investment Bank and private investors. Actually, private investors were the ones really interested in us, high net worth individuals, others who were more philanthropic and not the classical VC scene. So this was, for us, it was a game changer. We could raise the funds in order to really jump into our clinical trial, which is currently running in Europe, mostly in Germany. And so for us, it was as dreadful the experience was for the entire industry, as good it was for our small team, now 20 people.
And you were founded not with coronavirus in mind. I mean, this has enabled a bit of a repositioning, but was your purpose was always to broad spectrum antivirals?
Yeah, because what we targeting is a host cell approach, and we were probably the first one really genuinely targeting host cell factors of RNA viruses by using kinase inhibitors, MEK inhibitors. Meanwhile, we have also a proprietary one in early development, and this was so we were focusing on severe influenza as being the classical killer with more than 100 billion costs a year and between 100,000 and 500,000 casualties worldwide. But COVID-19, being a very similar class of viruses, was just the second one which we early started in looking into the preclinical efficacy and could early prove it and then go ahead for clinical development. And it's a similar mode of action, very similar. It's the same. The propagation of the virus is managed or is determined by the same pathway, the same route within the body cells. So it was perfectly fitting. It was, in the best sense, repurposing of a development drug targeting influenza.
Yeah, fascinating. I'd now like to turn to James, who will have a very different perspective on playing a big part in the pandemic response. And can you just walk us through how Accord Therapeutics was involved in I suppose as the pandemic hit and as we're heading into second waves?
Sure, and I guess well, firstly, thanks for giving me the opportunity to put our piece of the puzzle across. I probably agree with Mene. We actually started to see impact from COVID right back at the beginning of the year. Predominantly for us, we were a bit concerned about API, so active pharmaceutical ingredients coming out of China. So when COVID first started to break, we were watching very closely how that could impact on our access to the active ingredients. From the get-go, right back in sort of February, we had a very clear set of priorities, and that was to keep our staff safe and to ensure the flow of medicines. So I see generics as working very much in tandem with the brand industry. Clearly, a hell of a lot of medical care is resting on older, off-patent medicines, and that was very true with COVID, particularly in the intensive care units. And that was really one of the early challenges we had to surmount. So if you go back to sort of February, March time, we were starting to see borders close, supply chains were being severely impacted, yet at the same time you had a supernormal demand, particularly for medicines connected with ventilation. You saw this huge rise in the number of patients entering ICU. And back then, we had to act pretty quickly. I described those first 5 weeks a bit like the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan. We just had lots and lots of demand coming across at us, and we had no real idea the validity of that demand. It was becoming apparent some countries were stockpiling. We were seeing demand reach 20 times what normal demand would be. So we quickly had to try and get a handle on that, so we weren't putting valuable stock into markets that didn't really need it. So it was really about utility. How could we do the most good with the limited supply that we had? So my team actually built an epidemiological model. I was lucky my head scientist in Europe actually wrote the manual on mechanical ventilation, as it were. So he helped us understand the sequence of medicines that would be required to mechanically ventilate somebody, keep them in that induced coma. And then working through this model, we started to get a handle on country by country, week by week, what the consumption should look like. But I think as many in the industry, we didn't hold that to ourselves. We worked, and you'll probably hear from Adrian later, with the whole industry to start to align on this exceptional demand. And it became apparent we obviously couldn't work in concert. We worked with the competition authorities to come up with a clearinghouse concept where we could all feed in our potential supply volumes, and they could offset that against the demand that they were hearing from the different countries. And that way we could make sure that intensive care units continued to function. And I think it was a real relief as the first wave sort of alleviated that we did keep hospitals in stock for the whole period. And I think, it does provide a good example of how working together can overcome problems. And I don't just mean the generic industry. It's very important within that collective, many brand companies took part as well. And beyond that, we've all worked together looking at things like repurposing of medicines. You've heard from some of the others already about that. Things like dexamethasone are clearly products off patent. We've been working very hard to stay on top of the research so we can adapt our supply chains to that need as and when it arrives. So I think it's a great example of a case study where the whole industry has worked together to really try and fight the scourge of COVID and help society.
Yeah, really, really fascinating insights there. You kind of teed up Adrian a little bit already. So, I mean, Adrian, obviously one of the companies you work with is Accord, but across many players in this space, what was your perspective from Medicines for Europe?
Yeah, so thanks. I think at Medicines for Europe, we were on our guard as the others in the pharmaceutical industry fairly early on. Because we anticipated with the situation in China and the potential spread to other countries that we would face logistical and supply chain issues. So we very early asked for action at the level of the EU. We didn't get any, so we were just ignored in reality in January and February. but I think a lot of governments in the European Union, they didn't think that Europe would be hit by this. And then as James pointed out, when we saw what was happening in Italy, we also had, let's say, better information than most governments, because what we could see was that the demand was outstripping anything the industry could do to supply. And so we knew at that moment that we were going to face a major problem across all of Europe, and that's why we set up this special group involving generic and brand companies together. And we really did, I think, a fantastic coordination between the two sides of the industry, together with the companies there. James talked already about that project. But coming back, I think, there's a lot of talk in Europe about, the risks that we have with, supplies from India and China. And there are some risks, and we need to look at the resilience of our supply chains. But the reality is, in this pandemic, that the biggest risk came from Europe itself. So in March, basically the whole of Europe shut down, meaning all the borders closed. And also there was a threat at one point that governments would close down pharmaceutical factories as well. And if they had done that, we would have had a shortage in about a week and a half of everything in Europe. But one problem was that everybody closed the border to Italy. What most people don't know is Italy is the center of active pharmaceutical ingredient production in Europe. So not only were we trying to ship medicines into Italy because of the high demand, but we couldn't get the active pharmaceutical ingredients out of Italy to go to the factories in the other countries of Europe. And this was obviously a major problem. So we worked a whole weekend with the European Commission to try and get green lanes established so trucks could cross the borders again with medicines and related supplies. That was the fastest measure the European Commission has ever undertaken, one weekend, which was impressive. But we did a lot of other things. We needed a lot of regulatory flexibility during this crisis, because basically what most companies did for hospital ICU medicines was they re-imported some of the medicines they had exported to other jurisdictions, notably to China. And they brought those medicines back to Europe again to deal with the demand surge here. You cannot do that in Europe without a certain degree of regulatory flexibility. There were other measures there, and that had to be negotiated with the authorities in a coordinated European way. So that was quite critical. I think what we saw and what was most disconcerting, and really the biggest lesson learned, is that most governments in Europe at the beginning of the pandemic, including the European Union institutions, they panicked. They didn't know what to do, and they didn't know who to turn to. So I think the industry, the two sides of the industry, showed themselves to be capable partners to help. But to overcome panic, I think we also need to look at what was missing from our healthcare systems. And I think what was missing is, surprisingly, the healthcare systems in the countries, they don't have any overview really of the medicines market. So they don't have any information on how the market works. And so when there's a huge demand surge, and I know it's a similar challenge for the vaccines industry, really most governments in Europe don't have any clue how to manage that. And so there needs to be some sort of coordination between manufacturers and governments to solve that kind of issue, but also I think better digital tools in healthcare systems, which are wantonly lacking in Europe. I mean, amazingly
I'll hold you there because we do lessons learned is certainly the direction that we'll be going. But at this stage I just want to introduce our fifth and final panelist. So Mike, obviously Bayer is one of the few life sciences conglomerates that's still out there, so have a bigger picture of the pandemic than many really. What did the pandemic mean to you in particular and to Bayer?
Yeah, no, thanks, Dan. And very interesting to hear the other panelists and many of the things which resonate with us. And as you say, Bayer has a uniqueness in that we have a major crop science, so food production responsibility, consumer health, as well as the pharma business. For me personally, the first real signal, other than what was in the media, was we received a request from a regional government in China for an old anti-malarial product that Bayer produced, which I hadn't even realized we were the innovator for, but that was back in the 1950s we launched. And that was the signal thing was more significant was happening. And then things rolled on pretty rapidly as the pandemic spread worldwide. We established very quickly a cross-divisional team led by our overall CEO, where the heads of product supply, myself, and the head came together initially on almost a daily and then weekly basis. And we had three key aims. One was protect our employees. The second was ensure continuity of supply, and we heard about some of the challenges of that. And for example, just resonating with Adrian, one of our key supply centers in Yatta, which is near Bergamo, so right in the epicenter. And we were having desperately to approach regional governors to say, you have to let our people to the factory, otherwise you're going to actually end important access to life-saving medicines. The Green Lane topic I learned about in those discussions. And then the other was fighting the pandemic, where we were very active in repurposing drugs where we could, collaborating with groups like Bill and Melinda Gates to look at what was in our compound library. Our anti-thrombotic portfolio was very active, and we also got more rapid moving these from concept to actual studies that were up and running with investigators. And again, with what Manu was saying, just the speed and the collaboration between different companies, academic institutions, and regulators really showed everyone operating at their best. And also just allowing people's innovative ideas to come forward. So our head of genomics came in one day and said, all this testing demand we have, the governments can't meet. We have a very highly embedded PCR sites in our two research centers in Germany. So in the space of, we changed our lab in Berlin to a COVID testing lab, and we've done, I think, well over 30,000 tests now. So we're one of the major test centers serving Berlin and Brandenburg. And in North Rhine-Westphalia, we actually shipped our machines to one of the laboratories. So we quickly, just people a different view of what our resources were and what we could do to help fight this pandemic. So, and then we were also focused on areas like ensuring we could continue to supply our crop products and our consumer health products. So it was really fascinating to see this what some might see as a very large and sometimes slow to move company. Suddenly people developing ideas and the CEO signing them off in the space of a few hours. And the same, we did a lot of very good things, I believe, even with donations in our process, one which takes quite a long time. Normally that came down to the head of donations, myself, and the CEO signing off, and we usually would approve those within half an hour, whoever last looked at the email. So, and we really got, so those are the things I think we really learned as a company. I think it was inspiring for our employees as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, you're all teasing the next question already, expecting a lot of discussion around digital, speed of development, collaboration. I'm actually going to jump back to Adrian at this stage, because I know I cut you off kind of probably a little bit of mid-flow there, but what are really the lessons that are being learned and the tools that you're developing to help recover from the pandemic? Can you give us an overview there?
Yeah, so I think one of the key lessons learned, and here I'm going to dare speak on behalf of both sides of the industry, is that in Europe, because everyone panicked, you had a breakdown of it's a technical term in the EU treaties called EU solidarity, which is normally in a crisis, European countries are supposed to coordinate together and work together to help each other. In this particular case, it was about helping getting medicines to the patients that needed them, regardless of which country they were located in. And here, the industry really came together to work with the European Commission to say, look, we're going to try and ensure that we get the medicines to patients, and we're going to fight against hoarding and other types of panic behavior that's really out there. And I think that was very, great moment to see the industry and the EU working together for a very good principle. And I think it played a big role in opening things back up again in Europe and led to a lot of positive industry EU cooperation. As I said, how can this be improved going forward? I think one of the things that's surprisingly lacking in Europe, we have very big nationalized healthcare systems, essentially subsidized by governments. But there's very little data coming out of those systems, so very little is digitized, and what is digitized is not interoperable across countries. So as a result, when you have a crisis, it's very difficult to collect data and to use it. So during the crisis, I think the industry really stepped up and created that data. So as James pointed out, we did so for ICU medicine. So we developed, and with the help of Accord, a model to estimate how many patients there would be on ventilators, and how to distribute that to the different countries, and shared that with all the companies under the supervision of the competition authority, of course. And so we stepped in where there was a gap. But I think going forward, we need to see some digital tools being enhanced or built. These are not that complicated, at least as regards some of this epidemiological stuff or some supply chain information. This could be done relatively quickly and efficiently. But that was definitely a surprising gap that we saw. The other thing is, in a crisis, we saw that governments or agencies were often hesitant to act on imperfect information. So they would say, well, we don't have the full information, so we can't act. And I think in a crisis, you can't do that. You have to act on the basis of the limited and imperfect information that you have. And I think here again, for the companies that we worked with, generics mainly, but also some brand companies on the ICU, we had to take a few risks and say, well, this is what we think the data means, and this is how we think it should work out. I have to say, and James can give more on that, our predictive data was amazingly accurate. So I think we got a little bit lucky, but that was helpful. And I think governments need to take a few more risks when data is imperfect. I think this is a challenge.
Oh, over to you then, James. So, I mean, as you say, we were able to meet the demand for medicines. Just, what are the lessons that are learned? Is it that was too close to call?
Look, I mean, I think he was trying to get ahead of the situation and join the dots a little bit. We're not there yet, and I think one I would point out is we've got some unusual activities about to hit. Great news that vaccines are coming to market. That does have hidden consequences. And a classic, we spotted it a little while back. Suddenly you're going to need extra vials, typically. So the glassware, out of nowhere, there's a demand on the glassware that could run into billions of individual vials. Has that been planned into the system? Have people started to think about the consequence of those vials potentially going into the need to make vaccines? That could have a knock-on into chemotherapy, into other ICU medicines. And I think there are other things in the vaccination area, other co-meds and implications of a large proportion of the world's population overnight suddenly getting into an inoculation program. So I think planning ahead is one of the lessons. And I'd be very keen to talk to some of the others on the panel about how the two sides of the industry can point things out to each other in that regard. I think the two other lessons I learned during the pandemic, which I'd be keen to share. First one was actually check your facts. In the heat of a crisis, half-truths often get running around, and you can respond inadvertently. So we had a couple of instances where it looked like the solidarity that Adrian was referring to had broken down, that individual countries were taking decisions to enact export bans or to seize goods even. And we were starting to get quite responsive to that, talk to stakeholders, policymakers about these stories. And actually, when you got into the detail, there were more nuanced than that. We set quite a few hairs running before we got to the bottom of certain situations. So I think in the heat of the moment, it's worthwhile stepping back and checking facts. And the other big lesson I learned is the power of communications within a company. We actually had less staff absence during the period of COVID than we would normally have. And we put a large part of that down to the awareness we built with our team about the impact we were having on fighting the pandemic. It created a real war spirit, people wanted to come in to play their part in the battle. And I tell you, a lot of companies have never felt more cohesive and coherent because of the challenges of COVID. It's really helped us come together and demonstrate the impact we can have to improve society, to make it better. So I think that there were lessons for me. Plan ahead where you've got supernormal situations, check your facts, and make sure you tell people, in particularly your organisation, what you're doing and why. It builds cohesion.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, at that point, I'll turn it over to the question to Mene. I mean, you must be working with an incredibly empowered workforce at the moment, partly because of your pivots into COVID-19. I mean, what lessons are you learning within the organisation?
Yes, I think, I mean, again, and many of the, I won't repeat many of the comments that have already been made, but, supply, it ranges from everything from ensuring your supply chains are robust, because you need to make sure that your medicines continue to get to patients, and we haven't missed a single dose for a single patient across the world, ensuring your clinical trials keep running. So the pivot into digital sightless clinical trials has been really important for us. And then just the speed at which we've had to operate. So, to get 2 monoclonal antibodies into phase 3 and potentially generate data from a pivotal study in 12 months, right, from idea to data generation, I mean, it would normally take you 5 or 6 years. And it's just incredible to me that we've been able to generate 2 really high quality molecules that I think are going to be really, really important in the speed of in the speed at which we've done it. And then you just look at even the repositioning programs. We've written protocols in days, not weeks or months. We've got things approved with regulators in days, not weeks or months. The system has moved, right? And it really has moved to try and solve problems. Now, what's going to be interesting is, I think, when we do get back to a semblance of normality, how many of the lessons that we've learned around supply, around sightless clinical trials, around interactions with regulators, around how we make decisions in the company, how much of that sticks and can be sort of taken forwards to normal, in inverted commas, working versus pandemic working. And that's one of the things that we're working very hard now. What I would say, if I look at it sort of, I think COVID right now has probably accelerated our digital journey, which we were on already, but I think it's probably accelerated our digital journey by about 3 or 4 years. Because we've, by default, for all of our programs across every therapy area, had to work out how to run sightless trials, how to get medicines to patients' homes in terms of clinical trial sites, how to change our endpoints to be device-driven versus site-driven. There's a lot of change that we've encountered in our day-to-day programs, let alone our COVID programs. So it's been phenomenal, right? In terms of how we're working, it's very, very different. And of course, we're all working much more flexibly, right? I'm calling here from my kitchen. I can also say that we're having to change how flexible we are in our approach to flexible working, because the organisation has demonstrated that it can get an awful lot done, right, working from home. Now, it's not to say that it's not incredibly important to be working face-to-face and to be brainstorming together and to be seeing each other, but I think we, again, will have moved from where we were, we're going to go a lot further than we would have anticipated by having, a bit of flexible working. So it's been, for me, it's just an acceleration of things that we were doing. As they say in the US, it's Operation Warp Speed. We've seen change at a warp speed pace.
And the challenge will be to get everyone on board to embrace this as the new way, so we don't slip backwards.
Yes.
I'll pose the question to Bayer and to Mike. What are your key lessons learned as a result of the pandemic?
So I think nearly all we touched on what I said, James, and what Mene said, that we need to take forward these very positive aspects, particularly around collaboration and flexibility, into our next normal, and not slip back from some things which I think we should really keep. The spirit of solidarity, just one fact that I mentioned, we have this key site in Garbagnata near Bergamo. Our lost time due to illness has been less this year than in the last 2 years, despite, one, the burden of the pandemic, and two, many of the difficulties of people living with that. Just shows people's commitment, the shared belief to what we were doing. We had a chart we used early on in the first few months, which was the growth of the virus in terms of cases, and we plotted our digital interactions against that, and there was a remarkable similarity in increase. So we really completely, as Mene said, saw our digital transformation go forward over 2 or 3 months in something we've been planning for the next 3 or 4 years. And again, in our clinical trial area, we sort of experiments inside the clinical trial became sort of our standard way of working. And we actually gave the leadership of the group looking at how we reacted to a colleague who'd been in charge of clinical operations in China, because he brought a lot of learnings they had in that first couple of months while we were still not facing the same challenges. And then the team really brought together all those learnings and rolled them out worldwide. But I think it really speaks to when you have a shared common mission and really the ability of organizations to do incredible things, as Mene just spoke to, in terms of what everyone here has picked about what's achieved. In fact, you have to act with less knowledge to get things done, because if you wait for all the facts, you're going to find that you've been overtaken by events.
And a question of someone that's been involved in the drug repurposing efforts, where perhaps not having as much success as might have been hoped for. I mean, are there lessons we learn in terms of how we mobilize existing tools against a new threat?
So I think probably what I saw was a lot of well-intentioned efforts and energy, but things diffused too much. So lots of small studies, ideas, but lack of real scale. So I think the example that stands out is the UK recovery study, where there was a robust concept, a robust operating model, and something that could be implemented at scale and deliver real and right. When we look at repurposing drugs and studies, what we was rigorous enough in really putting in place good high quality protocols that could deliver data at speed and at scale. And it's really recovery and solidarity are really two of the few studies that, whereas there are hundreds of smaller studies which are interesting but will not change the trajectory of what we're facing.
Well, hopefully 2 models there to follow in terms of best practice. I'll pose the same question to Rainer now. I mean, what were the key lessons that Atriva Therapeutics has learned as a small biotech?
Yes, as I alluded beforehand, for us it was a booster. We suddenly were in the spotlight, at least here in Middle Europe, of being the government and some of the investors as well, and also large companies. For example, we got early on a cooperation with Evonik, which is a multinational, globally acting chemical manufacturing company. And for us, what really helped us by having been neglected beforehand, because nobody had a real focus on infectious disease because of a lack of a business model, helped us now to regain the momentum we had. We had been always a virtual company in a way that because our management team is quite experienced one, all of them have at least 20 years of experience in the industry, and so we worked from different locations, with the one in Tübingen for R&D, the other one here in Frankfurt where I'm living for all the rest, and also spread over from the Netherlands to Vienna. So for us, now the sudden digitalization and the virtualization of the business let's say, streamed were not a problem to us. It was rather more helping us in getting more thrust. We were also positively surprised that the infrastructure, which is always blamed here in Germany, so slow internet and so on, it perfectly worked. It was fine, much better than expected. So this is a really positive lesson learned for us. But also the other lesson more general is that there is, in the meanwhile, much more openness. We got a lot of contacts to Asia, which we started beforehand. And Asia is ahead of us in this, tackling these type of diseases. They have the experience with previous outbreaks of SARS, of the bird flu, and so on. They are even much more densely populated than we are, and the governments and the population have retained their awareness. And so I feel we can learn a lot of them how to early intervention. A colleague now just said the European governments were first a little bit sluggish and then suddenly panicking when they recognized that the wave were overcoming with the severe patient. And actually the same just happens right now, a little bit better prepared, but far away from really mastering it. This was certainly the same at the beginning in China, but then the other Asian countries, most of them took a good stance. Having said that, it helped us a lot also to build more connections, more cooperations, and speed up our business thrust. Especially, I have a good role played the European community. It was their European investment bank for us. They got this special facility on infectious disease, which we could benefit from with 25 million euros, which is a lot for a small biotech company. On the other hand, what we also did see that the interest in novel therapeutics a little bit diminished in the summertime, because at least in Germany, I felt again very safe, low amount of cases, no severe cases, hospitals empty. And so the focus was, of course, the right one on vaccination, because this is the future once it works, once it lasts the immune response, and once it's available for everyone. But in between, and we know how long it takes until a vaccine is really rolled out globally, especially if it's so sensitive to let's say, to humidity, to temperature, as the currents are. Therefore, we would have hope for more support from the government, especially also the national governments, to support also therapeutic attempts, especially therapeutics which would be focusing not only as a pure play antiviral, but also let's say having solutions for the immune modulation, which we feel both is important for if you really fight COVID in the decisive step of the disease progression. This is where a patient enters the hospital or shortly beforehand. This is where we have best possibilities to intervene successfully. But in parallel, we really appreciated this global cooperation, this global and unparalleled awareness now on the threats of infectious disease. And I strongly hope that this will be maintained in the future, and we got to maintain it in the future, because this will be not the last pandemics. It will be, others will come in.
Yeah, I'll hold you there, and I'll come straight back to you. But I want to now enter the final kind of third of our discussion, which is really about shaping the future. How can we forward facing? We're all in the position of being able to shape our industry and apply some of the lessons that we've learned and been talking about. So I understand with Atriva, your, I suppose, near future is mapped out with the successful funding that you've just been granted. So what's in your kind of near-term future?
Yeah, for us as a company,
so you've just been.
We are now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Unfortunately, connection. Oh, wonderful. Yes. Yeah, our future is, of course, to deliver what we are promising to our investors and the European Investment Bank, our clinical trials in COVID-19, and then a bit later the study in influenza. Both are global studies across almost all continents, and in addition, and then this is an investment at risk, which is supported by the European community, to ramp up our production facilities for our small molecule. It's a kinase inhibitor, in order to be prepared once our first clinical study will be successful, that we can rapidly get into approval and production. Because at the end, if you would like to have a pandemic awareness drug available, you need to have millions of doses available in order to protect people. This is not just, this is let's say, and there I only see that small molecules with a favorable production cost be suitable in order to have this role. This is certainly not biologics, where you have to we have costs of one dose of hundreds of euros or dollars. The health systems just cannot afford them. So I see for the future, if we would like to protect ourselves for pandemics, novel pandemics, you need to have broad spectrum drugs available for an early intervention, which are safe, which is of course important. There should not be put severe side effects on it, and have a decent efficacy against a panel of viruses, and very often it's the same type of viruses coming on from Zika, dengue, bird flu, others, yellow fevers, all the similar classes, and could be treated also with similar drug classes. And this is something we need to invest in, and it's recognized by people like the Bill Gates Foundation that this is needed. And I also were experiencing the change from their entire focus from vaccines now also to selected therapeutics.
We're certainly hoping that as many therapeutics are as successful as possible. Vaccines all we needed. You mentioned a little bit about cost and investment, and that's where I want to pivot back towards our generics participants here. And I'll pose the question to James. I mean, how do you see the future playing out, and how essential will investment be to help you achieve that future?
I think it's a complicated story, and I think it's important to get a bit of context here. Part of the wake-up call from the pandemic has been about the resilience of access to medicines. Historically, you've seen a lot of offshoring of manufacturing from Europe into cost geographies, and that's across the industry. That's not just a generic play, it also pertains to biopharmaceutical production. We do definitely want to case that we need to have a level playing field, incentives to produce medicines in, say, Europe. And you can definitely start to see that resonate with policymakers right now. And it's a bit like that whole concept in business studies, coming from Porter around the need for clusters. In many countries now, we've lost the ability to make nuclear plants. Well, the same thing's happening in the pharmaceutical world. By having many functions stop having new players come in, we lose those skills, the ecology breaks down. So I think that it does need to be recognition from policymakers, EC, national government, to incentivize production within Europe. My big concern there is you might just fund white elephants. They also have to fit with a competitive marketplace. So coming back to the generic industry, bearing in mind in Europe, 70% of medicines are in that off-patent archetype. In many countries, it's up to 80-85%. And many of them have a purely price-based, lowest cost procurement model. And that creates this dangerous fragility. Effectively, it creates a pressure to aggregate in the lowest possible locations. And you get this huge pruning of the ecosystem. Everyone starts to go for economies of scale. One player succeeds, and you have you have fragility. Effectively, if that company goes down, or that location is no longer accessible, the resilience of the system is pulled down. And we saw that not just with the pandemic, but a lot of aggregation in some of the cardiovascular drugs. One API company was supplying 70% of the world's API for that product, and then they had a quality problem. And there's no alternate, no plan B. So I think a key part for me is that we need to pivot the procurement methodologies and generics in a similar fashion to brands to most economically advantageous approaches. So you're looking for value procurement, not cost procurement. And governments and health systems should be looking at resilience as one of the points in their procurement assessment. If everything's coming from the same place, it's clearly not a very resilient supply chain. So I think that's the key thing I'm definitely talking about, is to try and make that clear to, please.
Just because I think you're absolutely right, and we've seen it. I mean, it's relevant to everyone, because if you think about just even how you go about doing contract research, whether it's chemistry or preclinical toxicology. We had almost all of ours based in China versus India. And of course, when the pandemic struck in China first, we were, in big doo-doos for a while, and we very quickly realized that not just do we have to have a much broader contract research set of agreements geographically, but you've got to work out how to make it, as you say, quite highly resilient, because this isn't going to, I don't think this is going to be the last time this happens. I think I've heard people talking about this is the century of pandemics. We're going to be. I think it really highlighted the problem. It's not just about cost, it's about resilience as well. And actually governments have found that out when they're trying to source PPE and, like say, vials and syringes and everything else that we need, and filters to make vaccines. I completely agree.
Well, I totally agree. And look, the challenge here is it's not either or, it's somewhere in the middle. No, a Brit saying this, no country is an island. We can't have a completely autarkic approach and try to produce everything in every country. That clearly isn't a goer either. It's about trying to find that halfway house, the third way, making sure that there's multiplicity in the systems, be it on access to clinical research competence, or be that on access to API or finished dose production or biopharmaceuticals. We need to have that considered. It's a bit, Nassim Taleb writes about anti-fragility. I think we need those sort of concepts where you try to bake into systems an inbuilt resilience that, effectively adversity almost makes it stronger. And I think, part of the things I was saying about our response to the pandemic, and everyone on this panel probably feels the same, it's made the staff base more resilient and more coherent and cohesive. So there's positives, there's silver linings to this. Last one I would just touch on, everyone's over focused on COVID. The bigger hidden public health crisis that will cost more lives than COVID has been the impact of the provision of care in other therapeutic settings. And I think as an industry, we've got a duty to really make people aware of that. The diminishment of cancer treatment is a hidden tragedy. We're one of the biggest providers of chemotherapy in Europe. We've noticed it has not come back. And governments and health systems, despite COVID, have to look to tackle that, because that will kill many more people than the virus will. So I think that's a hidden long-term challenge we're going to have to face now.
Very well said.
Can I just make one more comment, because I do think there's something we haven't talked about, and I think it's also highly relevant. Is the other thing that I think this has highlighted to many governments around the world is the importance of our industry. Yeah. Actually, we heard Mike talk about the fact that they've set up a testing, that they repositioned a lab to do testing in Berlin. We did the same in Cambridge. And I think governments have realized the importance of the life science sector for the viability, actually, both economically and from a health perspective of our industry. And they've also realized, many of them, that they don't have a sufficiently robust and resilient industry there, whether it's in the diagnostics business, whether it's in the manufacturing of antibodies or vaccines, or in the generation of new molecules. And I think that has opened a lot of eyes up, which is, for us in this sector, an opportunity in all of our respective countries and the country in which we operate to strengthen and solidify our positions, and to make sure we don't lose that momentum of the importance that our sector has to both social, economic and health prosperity for our countries and the world. Sorry, I just thought that was something worth adding.
No, I completely agree with that, and I think we should never forget, you look at how life expectancy has changed over the last 150 years. It's doubled in that time, and one of the biggest causes of that extension of life, as well as improved quality of life, is our industry. We should be very proud about that and make sure that policymakers don't forget it.
All very well said. I'll just jump in because I'll try and wrest control a little bit. We actually haven't had any audience questions come through, so I'm happy to let the conversation continue. I will just give the last final words to Mike, actually, because we haven't heard from you in a little while, before we close the session. But if you were to kind of cast the industry in, the future of the industry, what would you be focusing on Perhaps what hasn't been anything, if there's something that hasn't been covered just yet.
I think really picking up on some key themes. One is take forward the positive learnings we've developed in terms of how we operate digitally, virtually, because that increases our speed, flexibility, and also will make us more efficient. Mene and James are very eloquent just now, and this really is a healthcare crisis, and we are at the front and foremost of that, and I think demonstrated what we can offer. I think this is a European group, and we've seen over the last few years a belief that innovation is somehow dying out or not active in Europe. But if you look at actually where some of the critical innovations are coming from AstraZeneca, from the vaccine companies, a lot of that innovation, and there's a lot of innovation going on in Europe, and hopefully that will reinvigorate the willingness and to develop those skill sets which are critical, health-wise and economically in the future. So we probably would absolutely say I wish to live through this, but I think the things that we have learned positively, we need to make sure we capture and take forward, because we saw how easy it is to slip back just in the summer, how people were relaxed in Northern Europe and maybe didn't take seriously enough what was ahead of them. So I think let's really reflect on what we've learned, what we need to do, and what we need to take forward to really invigorate and improve our contribution to society.
Oh, that's a very good note to leave it on, so thank you very much. We have run out of time, so I'd like to thank our panelists for taking part in today's brilliant discussion.